process of co-creating a relationship is really fascinating because we have to dynamically balance the sense of togetherness, our shared union, our shared identity, that is the relationship, and our individuality. And those are opposing forces. And this is one of those things where two people who are very compatible, who love each other, they're attracted to each other, they have similar values and vision. But structurally, when our system loses that balance, it shows up in the contact point with the relationships. Often, the first time we're with someone we actually see a future with and we actually feel safe, that's when all our stuff comes out. Because that's the first recreation of the parental dynamic outside of childhood. So at a subconscious level, everything's getting reenacted. And it's kind of a mind fuck because you're like, oh, this is the person, but we're fighting like cats and dogs. One of the things that came up for Lee a lot in the early part of our relationship was a lot of the source of the conflict we experienced was her system's way to create separation because that was the only way she could have herself. Because what was not available in her attachment system was I can have you and I can have me too. So it had to be an either or. Funny enough, I had my version of that too, which showed up in a different way. For me, the way it showed up was I would sacrifice my needs when we were together and I would hyper focus on her needs. So usually in a relational system, we polarize the other person. So we take on the reciprocal pattern. That's how relational systems create a level of homeostasis or stability. In essence, the conflict for her was a distance regulator. Because if we were too close, then she would start losing her sense of self, which didn't feel good or felt unsafe or felt panic inducing. And the solution to that was the conflict. So the conflict was not the problem. The conflict was actually the solution. And so when we see couples where there's a lot of conflict, that is one of the first interesting frames to explore. Because it really feels like when we engage with people and if conflict comes up, well, that's the problem. Like the conflict is the reason why we can't be together. But sometimes when we examine that closer, we actually see that the conflict is the only thing that's mediating this relationship. Because if the conflict disappeared, then we would actually have to face or confront an experience that would feel too blank, too challenging, too vulnerable, too intimate. Because for her, too much intimacy was actually scary, even though that's what she wanted the most. Now, I'll share the other side of that, which for me, intimacy was scary in a different way. It was scary because I would lose myself in intimacy and I was already bracing for whatever. So for me to survive, I had to disconnect from myself and hyper focus on the other person who's in the space with me. So in the early years of our relationship, what happened was that when we were together, I was hyper focused on her needs and I really could not self. So I de-selfed and my focus went to her and taking care of her. And when we would have space, that was the first time I was like, ah, like now my brain can actually work and I can actually be like, okay, what is happening in my life? Like, what do I need to do? It was like a huge sigh of relief. And even though I wasn't the one initiating the conflict, I was in those occasions was escalating the conflict and then keeping us in conflict state by being unwilling to open my heart and fully reconnect. It's like lock and key. We're both playing it out, but it was for very different reasons and it looked very different. But in this case, actually, the conflict is the gift. As you very astutely pointed out, that I've also never cared about someone like I care about you, right? Those are two sides of the same coin. And the only way we move past and through the conflict is to not see it as the problem, which is a total mindfuck. But inside the conflict is the solution to the conflict. And actually inside the conflict is a solution to a larger thing. And when we actually understand what that architecture is, like what is the purpose that this conflict is serving, and then how do we meet those needs for both of you, then that need does not have to be met by the conflict. If part of this is he needs some time away for his brain to turn off service mode, that can be built in structurally, right? So one of the things I'll just share, like we've cohabitated, we've lived apart. Right now we do this hybrid thing where Lee has her own place, but she spends like 60% of the week with me at my place. And at some point we'll come back and live together again. But like the one of the reasons why we did this was because we realized that we both need to train our nervous systems in a slow, gradual, titrated way to learn how to attach in a healthy way, where when we're together, I can have me and I can have her too. Because how it used to be, I couldn't have me when I had her. So being with her created a loss of self for me, which is not sustainable. Like that's not a stable relationship. And the same thing for her in a different way. So once we understand like, hey, this conflict is actually the solution, it's serving us in these ways, let's address those things structurally. Then we ease the pressure that the conflict is carrying, and then there's less conflict over time. And then we can actually like start to train with each other on those specific skills, which for Lee was individuating because she would get enmeshed. She would lose her sense of self in her own way. So the journey that she's been on has to individuate, become her own self. For me, the core skill was differentiation, which means I have to practice being different because I would fall into it. Again, notice that these are reciprocal skills because usually the anxious person will not always, but often attract the avoidant person to play out the anxious avoidant dance. Sometimes the avoidant person will attract another avoidant person and they'll play this arm's length relationship game. I'm sharing this to start to build a little bit of a almost a visual map for you because once we drop below the level of like, hey, we fight a lot and I don't know if we can be together. So you actually start to understand, like, oh, let's see what's actually happening. Oh, interesting. Like you have trouble differentiating and I have trouble. Then we can have this sense of relief that, hey, it's not that we can't be together. It's that the way we've been relating, it was either too much too soon or we just hadn't figured out what the right structure is for us, but we can train intentionally and we can get there. So this is going to sound a little crazy. Andrew doesn't exist. Andrew is a creation of your consciousness. Andrew has no independent existence. I don't exist right now. I'm a creation of your consciousness. Brittany doesn't exist. Everyone in your life, including yourself, like your sense of self, is a construction. And I'll tell you why this is important. This is important because we live in a sovereign universe as sovereign beings. And the only way we can be truly sovereign is if we have full power, agency, autonomy to choose, right? What that means is, by definition, every single thing in our reality, in our life, in our relationships, is something we are choosing, is something we are creating. In those times with Lee, when we were just duking it out, I was creating that version of her because I needed that version of her to exist for the reciprocal version of me to exist. And then when I moved through those lessons, magically she's different. And it'll keep going like that. The frame we teach here is one of radical ownership and responsibility. Because it's like, if my partner is coming at me, the victim frame is like, oh my God, like he always does this, like he always ambushes me. The sovereign frame is, oh, interesting. Like, how am I creating that? How am I in agreement with this reality? That's why if someone's single and they're very avoidant, and they want love, but they only seem to attract men who are unavailable. It's easy to blame the men. It's be like, oh, men these days, blah, 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 not useful or empowering. If we ask, like, how am I creating this experience? Now, this is cool for many reasons. I also caveat that there are people in this world who are actual victims, that it's a legitimate experience where they're perpetrated on because a lot of fucked up things happen in the world. We're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about a radically different way for us to experience reality and relationships, which brings the power inside ourselves. Because he doesn't need to be in the room for you to single-handedly change this entire dynamic in relationship. And I guarantee, just from a few minutes of talking to you, that's exactly what you're going to do. Because like I can feel the like how much you care and how willing you are to see yourself. And I just wanted to share this because what Lee's going to talk about relies on us seeing our partner through this frame. Because usually, like every time we've gone into conflict, it's because I'm not willing to really hear her and see her perspective. And every time I've completely let go of my perspective and totally collapsed that and like, listen, I would love to understand like what I can do differently here. Can you share how you're seeing something? Because I'm trying to understand what's happening here. Completely changes the game.
The first thing here is that there has to be someone who's willing to listen first. Because I've heard you say, very similar to me, that sometimes you or both of you get argumentative or defensive, and you're both fighting to be heard. And both of you feel like you're not hearing me. And it can feel infuriating when that is the dynamic. So because you're the one on these calls and he is not here, then you have the unique honor of listening first because you're receiving this. So there's a couple things here. And I'll share some theory and concepts in psychology, and then we'll ground this. So there's a concept in psychology called repetition compulsion. And like Ani said earlier, our subconscious, and I shared this with some of you on your intimacy deep dive call, will compulsively recreate scenarios that are similar to scenarios from childhood so that we can master them. Our brain is always looking to evolve. Our consciousness is always looking to evolve. And what that looks like sometimes is repeating the same argument over and over and over again, like Groundhog Day, until we go crazy. But we are looking to master the situation. So every time that same pattern comes up, you can ask, how can I create a different level of mastery? What else can I see here? If I'm creating this again, or if we're co-creating this together again, there's another level of mastery for me to cultivate here. Our brain is always looking to resolve the thing that creates imbalance in the psychological system, just like our body's always looking to resolve what creates imbalance in the physiological system. And we're going to do that in our relational system as well. So if the pattern keeps coming up, this can be a more empowering frame. Oh, I'm getting the invitation to create a different level of mastery around how I navigate my internal world, how I get curious about his, how I communicate something. You'll intuitively know what that experience is serving up on a platter for you. Similar to what Ani said here is if we choose that we're going to be the first ones, and a lot of the way that the feminine, and I'm using those interchangeably, though it's not necessarily related to gender, a lot of the way women can lead is through embodiment. Like we just are being that thing. We are that way. And that inspires someone to shift or to look within, right? Whereas the masculine way of leadership is more directive. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to do it by this time, and you're going to do it in this order. It's directive, it's penetrating, it's precise, it's efficient. We can bring that kind of leadership to work or the relationship. And what typically works when we're relating to a man is when we show up with a feminine form of leadership, which is embodiment and leading through inspiration. So, one, feminine leadership here could look like choosing to be the first one who's going to drop everything about your experience, even if just for that one conversation, you put aside your perspective. And it's not that it doesn't matter or it's not important. It's that, hey, just as an experiment, let's see what happens if I let today be all about him. You might ask questions like, how are you really feeling? you might ask, what need is going unmet for you right now? What do you really want me to know? If I gave you all ears and I wasn't gonna get defensive or angry, what would you really want me to know? And then as he says it, really sit with it and digest it. It likely will puncture, trigger, activate, bring something up, bring up some sort of defense about how you're not always that way or how you sometimes do the thing that he's saying you're not doing. But what about this time? Let all of that come up. Let yourself be penetrated by what he says. And let yourself feel something about it without needing to do anything about the feeling. And I'm using a very specific word, penetration. It's a very provoking word. Unless things can actually get in, we're never going to fully feel. And we're never going to be able to have the full energetic exchange of love that we desire, that we somewhere know is possible, that we're not fully experiencing. It's going to feel like that bottomless black hole.
Another thing you can play with, as just to switch things up with the penetration frame, is the ownership frame, which is in that moment, can you completely like jump from your side to his side and see yourself and the situation through his eyes? As in, can you fully own his perspective, completely let go of your own, right? And the reason why we do either of these things is because we get to empathy by demonstrating empathy. We get to intimacy by doing intimacy. And if you think about it, in any conflict, what's the difference between conflict and intimacy? Conflict is this, right? Intimacy is this. I have to allow the person in for there to be that intimacy. And if this person is coming, they're unwilling to budge. If I allow them in, single-handedly, that changes the structure of the relationship.